Hi, welcome to my Communication Capstone presentation. I'm Harry Smith, and today I will be presenting on my project, False Dichotomy, How Restrictive Narratives Inhibit Development of Bisexual Men. I want to start quickly by just giving a little statistic of a study that was done by Pew Research in 2013. They stated that bisexuals make up 40% of the LGBTQ plus community, making up the largest percentage of that community. But the study also found that bisexual individuals that they interviewed, only 28% said that they were out to other people, compared to 71% of gay women and 77% of gay men that they interviewed, showing that there's a large discrepancy in how they're represented, how visible they are, and how that affects their ability to be comfortable with their identity. So my intervention for this project was to create a discussion among my peers that allows for the visibility and acknowledgement of sexually fluid men. My research was done through one in-person interview and two through Zoom. My original intent was to do a documentary, but because of the pandemic and the school closing, I had to change my project and turn it into a paper format. And so I did 3 in-depth interviews with men who identify as either bisexual or sexually fluid. And my 3 research questions, the primary one was that I wanted to learn how men who identify as sexually fluid reflect on how they came to develop that identity. And then the other 2 were subsequent to that. So the second one was how, what role their upbringing played in that development of their identity. And then the third was what role does media representation play in the development of their identity. So the communication topics that my project looked into were identity and ideology, a study that I found was super fascinating. It had 2 distinct conclusions, and one that is attraction is not equal. So for bisexual individuals, attraction to men is not indicative of their attraction to women, and also poverty and race contribute to bisexual behavior. So Black men and men of lower economic status are more likely to engage in bisexual behavior than white men or men of higher socioeconomic status, which I just found super interesting. And then also Althusser's idea of interpolation. So the idea that ideology hails us as subjects, which is just a fancy way of saying that we're born into identities that come with rules and expectations. And the one that I'm primarily looking into is that the male identity comes with societal expectations of masculinity. And then also power. So I used Foucault's theory of how discourse, the way that we talk about things, creates our public knowledge of that thing, and then that becomes what we consider to be our reality, and then that creates the power structures that we live in. And then finally, representation. So how poor representation harms both the queer and straight community. Obviously, poor representation harms the queer community because they don't get to see themselves accurately represented. It also harms the straight community because they just have overall incorrect ideas and beliefs about members of the queer community. So finally, what we all came here for, my findings. So I wanted to really quick just say that terms such as bisexual, queer, sexually fluid are not universal, and they're not intended to be. And I made sure that my subjects felt comfortable enough to define it for themselves, which they did, and I noted in my paper. One of the primary findings I found was that family offers no messages. Their families offered no messages about sexual orientation other than heteronormative messages. Their fathers perpetuated traditional messages about masculinity, policed their behavior in the way that they talked, behaved, acted, dressed, and they tended to ignore their son's attraction to men. So 2 of my subjects are out to their fathers, and their fathers kind of heard the fact that, oh, you're into women, and they latch onto that, and they ignore the fact that their sons are also attracted to men. And then one of my subjects talked about how he was bullied by his older brother growing up, and was called the F slur because his brother thought that he was acting too feminine. And two of my subjects were heavily affected by church and homophobic messages that they heard growing up, and the traditional gender roles that the church kind of um, lays out for the congregation. And then growing up, they all talked about how their friends kind of restricted their development. One of them talked specifically about how they internalized like the phrase "that's so gay" and they used it themselves, not realizing that they were in turn putting themselves down. Um, but they talked about how growing up, or how when they got older, they were able to be more selective about who they chose to be friends with, and looked for people who they thought would help them flourish in their identities, which they all noted to be one of the best parts of being queer, which is that um, you get to meet so many people in the community of different backgrounds and perspectives, um, and seeing people be so open about themselves and who they are helped them to flourish in their own identities. All three of them talked about instances of biphobia and birasure, which is just the dismissal of bisexual identity. They each had received different reactions from men and women. Um, Overall, though, it seemed that women were more accepting of their identity. For some, um, that was only if it was a platonic relationship, and once it stepped into like a romantic or sexual context, then women started to be more hesitant about accepting that part of them. Also, because all three of my subjects were men of color, it was not possible to ignore how race intersected with their sexuality. All three of them found cultural barriers that affected them. Two of my subjects were Black men, and they found that their family was so preoccupied with dealing with issues of racism that they often had to, they felt that they had to be silent on other issues that they were dealing with in their lives. And then my third subject, who is Filipino, talked about how just representations in media of men as like sexually impotent and undesirable made it really hard for him to develop in his own identity. And then leading into representation, which overall just bisexual characters and celebrities are nearly non-existent. They talked about how queer representation is almost always gay white men. And interestingly, I didn't know this when I picked my three subjects, but all three of them are artists. And they talked about how they want to use their work to promote diversity and self-expression, which I thought was cool. And then the last thing we talked about was just looking to the future. So what do they want to see happen in terms of society and acceptance of different identities? And they overall said that they want to see more representation in society, particularly government. One of them talked about how it makes them really uncomfortable that laws are made about them by people who don't belong to the communities that they're making laws about. And he says that it just feels unfair. And so they talked about how they want to see just more representation of bisexual people like, in TV shows, in movies, but also just in everyday life. People holding public office and stuff like that. And they also talked about they want to see more freedom of sexual expression. So just overall, like just getting rid of the idea that sexuality belongs to a binary and that you either have to be gay or you're straight. And just letting people be who they are and explore their sexuality in non-dichotomous scenarios. And so just overall, in conclusion, my first research question kind of yielded the results that they found that friends in the community and positive media representation were the biggest sources of how they developed their identity. The second research question was kind of hard to answer because all of them said that they didn't really feel like they were nourished in their development from their families. And that overall, just like the heteronormative messages that they got from their family made it really hard to develop their sexual identity. And then the third research question, just overall representation was lacking. Available representation required them to seek out representation that they felt looked for them, represented them, so they would have to go out and look in these niche areas where they could find characters that they thought reflected who they were. So that is my presentation. Thank you so much for listening. And once again, I really hope that once everything calms down, I'm able to continue this research and go out and conduct more interviews, hopefully actually turn this into a documentary that I can go out and show to local communities and just actually create a discussion around this and not have this just be some research that I did that sits on my laptop. So once again, thank you so much for listening. Have a great day. Can't turn this off. There we go. No, I didn't stop it. Now I'm stopped.